All right, we've been looking at the Dispensational Futurist eschatological system with a pre-tribulation rapture followed by a 7-year period of Great Tribulation, during which time the majority of the events of the book of Revelation will unfold. The book of Revelation chapter 4 through 19, or Revelation 6 through 19, depending on what dispensational futurists you're talking to. They say that the majority of the book of Revelation will only take place during this 7-year period of Great Tribulation. And so they relegate pretty much the entirety of the book of Revelation to this future time period after the rapture and before the second advent. So today we're going to be looking at the 7-year period of Great Tribulation fallacy. This is a fallacy. This is where they get the idea of a 7-year period of Great Tribulation is from the Messianic prophecy, and it is a Messianic prophecy. It has nothing to do with Antichrist. The Messianic prophecy of Daniel 9:24 through 27. Okay, and we're going to show that the dispensational futurist teaching that only the first 69 weeks of this 70-week prophecy were fulfilled in the 1st century AD, and that the 70th week, or the last 7 years, is still seeking future fulfillment after a pre-tribulation rapture, and that this is totally fallacious and without biblical warrant, as their teaching is dependent upon the insertion of a time gap in between the end of the 69th week and the beginning of the 70th week. So while it's a 70-week prophecy, they say, well, there's a big, huge gap of time where the 69th week ended and when the 70th week will begin. Okay, huge time gap in there, which actually makes the 70-week time prophecy much longer than the biblically allotted 490 days, literal years. When we're dealing with Bible prophecy, we use the day for year principle in all of them, I would assert. Not just some of them, all of them. Otherwise, you're inconsistent. You can't just use it in Daniel 9:24 through 27, the day for year principle, and then not use it for the 1260 days, 42 months, or time times half a time Bible prophecy. We'll get into that more in the next video on Antichrist. But here we're focusing on this 7-year period of tribulation and where dispensational futurists get this idea. And we're going to show that the insertion of a time gap is utterly without warrant, and 2, that the dispensational futurist interpretation of Daniel 9:24 through 27 is flawed because, and I bolded this for a reason, they begin with the wrong date and decree of Artaxerxes for the commencement date of the 70 weeks prophecy. They're digging in the wrong place, the wrong date and decree of Artaxerxes for the commencement date of the 70 weeks or 69 weeks time prophecy. Before we do, I just want to play a little clip. Hopefully this will work. This is Pastor Nelson from BibleMunch.com, I think it is the website. And he's addressing a question right here at the bottom. What is the end times tribulation? So let's hear what he has to say.
Today's question is, what is the tribulation? How do we know the tribulation will last 7 years? In this video, I'll answer that question from a biblical perspective. And afterwards, as always, I'll share some helpful resources, so stick around to the end. The tribulation is a future 7-year period of time when God will finish his discipline of Israel and finalize his judgment of the unbelieving world. The church, made up of all who have trusted in the person and work of the Lord Jesus to save them from being punished for sin, will not be present during the tribulation.
Okay, there you go. 7-year period of tribulation. The church is not going to be here because they've been raptured from the earth. They've been taken up to heaven. Okay, and we looked at the last video that I made on the rapture, that dispensational futurists believe that the rapture and the second advent are 2 temporally separate events. Temporally means separated by time, and it's the rapture and the second advent, they assert, is separated by a 7-year period. Okay, even down here, if you can read this at the bottom left, it says, what is the end times tribulation? If you're looking for a tribulation definition and explanation of these 7 years of tribulation, watch this tribulation video. In it, Pastor Nelson with Bible Munch uses the Bible to explain what happens during what? Daniel's 70th week. Daniel's 70th week. And the Great Tribulation time within it, which all follows after many signs of the end times, and it follows the pre-tribulation rapture. Okay? I'm going to go back to my notes here. There we go. Okay. So, really the whole dispensational futurist eschatological system is dependent upon this 70-week time prophecy of Daniel. And let's just read through the prophecy itself just to make sure we get an idea of what it is. And this is again Daniel 9, 24 through 27, and I'm using the ESV here, the English Standard Version. So if you have your own translation, go ahead and crack that open and do some comparison. But this is from the ESV, and this is the 70 weeks time prophecy. 70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin and to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint a most holy place. Know therefore and understand, and this is important, this bold part here, that from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem, to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, that's Jesus, there shall be 7 weeks. Then for 62 weeks it shall be built again with squares and moat. Now notice real quick, there shall be 7 weeks and then 62 weeks. So adding 62 to 7, that's 69 weeks. So now we already have 69 weeks of this 70 weeks time prophecy. Okay? But it will be built in a troubled time. And after the 62 weeks, which is really after the 69 weeks, adding that first 7 to the 62, that's 69 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war. Desolations are decreed. And he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week. And for this is the last week. So we had 69 weeks. Here's the 70th week. And for half of the week, or in the midst of the week, he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abominations shall come one who makes desolate, until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. So we're looking for the decree, the going forth of the word or decree to restore and build Jerusalem as our starting point for the 70 weeks. Okay, and I'm going to assert that the dispensational futurists are settling on the wrong date and decree from Artaxerxes for their commencement date of the 69 weeks. We're going to get into that. So let's go here. Dispensationalists assert that the first 69 weeks of Daniel's 70 weeks time prophecy were fulfilled in the 1st century AD at the triumphal entry of Christ into Jerusalem, but that there is a time gap between the end of the 69th week and the beginning of the 70th week, a time gap which has been thus far nearly 2,000 years, and it won't begin, that 70th week won't begin until after a pre-tribulation rapture. Okay? So time gap, they are completely dependent upon this time gap. Dispensational futurists teach that only at the time of the rapture, which again in their view is a temporally separate event than the second advent, only then, after the rapture, will the 70th week of Daniel's prophecy begin. Many scholars, though not all, I'll admit not all, are in agreement though that the 70 weeks time prophecy should be interpreted using the day equals year principle. And I'm in agreement with that. I'm in absolutely agreement with that. The day for year principle needs to be utilized. And for biblical precedent of that, you can see Ezekiel 4:6, even though Ezekiel was contemporaneous with Daniel. But you can also see Numbers 14:34. Read those two texts. I have given you a day for a year in both of those particular time prophecies. So in all the time-specific prophecies of Scripture, especially in the apocalyptic books of Daniel and Revelation, I believe, and I'm going to assert, and I'm going to stand on this argument, that we need to use the day equals year principle for all of them, not just the ones we selectively choose. All of them. Otherwise, we're inconsistent. So, according to the day-year principle, when we are given a time-specific prophecy in Scripture, especially in the Apocalypse, okay, I already said that, we are to use the day equals year principle in all of them, not just the ones we selectively pick and choose. Preterists might do this a little bit, but dispensational futurists definitely pick and choose when they're going to use the day for year principle. And I'm not a preterist, by the way. Just want to make that clear. Apparently, I'm going to have to start doing videos on preterism because it's, I think, becoming a little bit more popular, especially amongst Reformed circles, and I am concerned about that as a Reformed Credo Baptist myself. So we'll have that'll be a subject for a whole nother video series. So the 70 weeks time prophecy then, 70 weeks of 7 days each equals 490 days. They should be interpreted as referring to a literal 490 years using the day equals year principle. And dispensational futurists agree with this. They are in agreement with this. It's just their gap theory between the 69th and 70th week is flawed. So they agree that the day equals year principle should be used in the prophecy of Daniel 9:24 through 27. The major flaw is their theory that a time gap should be inserted between the end of the 69th and the beginning of the 70th week. And this time gap has been so far a period of almost 2,000 years. And my argument is no time-specific prophecies in Scripture allow the insertion of a time gap in the midst of the prophecy. Once the prophecy begins, it continues until it is complete. No time gaps allowed. Let's see. Yeah, so dispensational futurists assert, along with this time gap theory, that God's plan for the Jews is not yet complete because the Jewish people still have 7 years. The prophecy said 70 weeks are determined upon your people, Daniel, that is the Jews. So this is why dispensational futurists have a different program for the Christian church than for Israel. So Israel and the church have there's two different programs going on. And once the church is removed at the rapture, then God will focus his attention on Israel. And they think that's the modern nation state that calls itself Israel over in the Middle East. Okay, so that's a big issue for dispensational futurists. They're always looking to the Middle East and what's going on there. Even with like presidential elections, they will look at what presidential candidate is going to give the most support to Israel. Okay, and they're even under the delusion that God is blessing America because of how generous we are with Israel and toward Israel. Okay, so this has a whole political ramification as well. But this is where it comes from. They believe that God still has 7 years left to work in, with, and through the Jews, especially in the modern nation state of Israel. Okay. Their insistence that the modern nation state of Israel was in 1948 not only a fulfillment of Bible prophecy, but that the nation has a pivotal role to play in the end times events, especially during the last 7 years of prophetic history between the rapture and second advent. And then the millennial reign comes after the second advent. And the issue of the millennium is, again, a subject for a whole nother video. But let's look at the dispensational futurist teaching of when the 70 weeks time prophecy is said to begin. This is important. Dispensational futurists assert that the 70 weeks time prophecy began in 444 or 445 BC. And again, the reason I write it this way is because it depends on how you judge a year-to-year beginning and end, if it's a fall to fall or a spring to spring. So I put 444, 445 BC, with the second decree of Artaxerxes given in Nehemiah chapter 2. And I'm going to assert that this was not actually a royal decree, but consisted of letters given to Nehemiah to repair damage that had apparently been done to a city which was already in the process of being rebuilt. It only took Nehemiah 52 days to complete this project. Okay, Nehemiah was the cupbearer of Artaxerxes. And if you read in Nehemiah chapter 2, it actually appears as if Artaxerxes doesn't really want Nehemiah to go. Like he's going to miss Nehemiah. He kind of likes Nehemiah, wants him around. But Nehemiah's like, oh, if I've found favor with the king, please let me go do this. So Artaxerxes let him go do this. And according to Nehemiah 6, chapter 6, verse 15, again, it only took 52 days. Hardly enough time to rebuild an entire city. This was a repair job that he was going to do, that Nehemiah was going to work on. So if the 69 weeks times 7 days of each week equals 483 days, or day for year principle, 483 years, began in the year 444, 445 BC, the dispensationalist proposed commencement date for the 69 weeks, then all we need to do is add 483 years to the 444, 445 BC date. And when we do, we come to 38 or 39 AD, which is far too late for the triumphal entry of Christ into Jerusalem, let alone the crucifixion. Okay? Most scholars will say that the crucifixion of Christ took place in about either AD 30 or AD 33. I personally settle for an AD 30 date as the time of the crucifixion of Jesus. Okay? But nobody is going to assert that the triumphal entry or the crucifixion took place in as late as 38 or 39 AD. Okay? Nobody's going to assert that. And dispensational futurists know they have a problem with their commencement date, 444, 445 BC, adding 483 years to that. They know that this is a wrong date. Okay? And they do try to reconcile it. We'll go through that a little bit. Dispensational futurists, because they know that their math doesn't add up, will then attempt to argue that the Jews used a 360-day calendar year, which would give us only about 476 literal years. Okay, so they need to reduce that 483 years, the 69 weeks, to about 476 literal years, because they know their math doesn't add up. Okay, and they say the Jews used a 360-day calendar. And so comparing our 365.25 day calendar with their 360-day calendar, we need to reduce the 483 years to 476 years. Okay? It gets a little bit complicated, but dispensational futurists, they try hard. I give them an A for effort, that's for sure. So, and then they assert that if you assert that it should be 483 literal years, they think that that is fallacious. That is fallacious because the Jews used a 360-day calendar, not a 365.25 day calendar. Remember, there are 365.25 days in a year, not 365. Okay, that's why we have a leap year every fourth year. It's actually 365.24 and some change. Okay? However, my argument against this is that it is dispensational futurists who fallaciously assert that the Jews used a 360-day year. In fact, for practical purposes, they did use a 360-day year, but for their actual calculations, they were well aware that their monthly lunar calendar of 12 months of 30 days each did not coincide with the yearly solar calendar of 365.25 days. And they had a way to reconcile this. Okay? So for actual calculations, they'd use the 365.25 day year. Nearly all the peoples of the ancient Near East used a practical yearly calendar of 360 days because they used a 12-month, 30-day calendar based on the lunar cycle. However, they all of them, including the Jews, had differing ways of reconciling this 360-day practical calendar with the actual 365.25 day solar year. Okay, these people were not ignorant of timelines. Okay, in fact, we can even go to the book of Genesis and say God put the sun, moon, and stars in the sky to tell the time, to tell the times of the changes of the years and of the seasons, etc. Okay, the sun, moon, and stars are God's time clock. And the Jews reconciled this discrepancy by adding, the Jews, for example, would add an entire month of 30 days to their 12-month, 30 days each calendar every sixth year to make up for this discrepancy. So every sixth year, instead of having 12 months of 30 days, they would have a year that was 13 months of 30 days. They added an entire month every 6th year to make up for the discrepancy of their 360-day time calendar. So again, I write this is similar to our way of adding an entire day to our calendar year every 4th year to make up for the loss of the 0.25 days for the preceding 3 years, plus the 4th year in which the addition of the day rests, because a solar year is not an actual 365.25 days or 365 days, but an actual 365.25 days, and we call it a leap year. Well, they had a leap year too, and they added an entire month to their calendar. So dispensational futurists are in error concerning their proposed commencement date for the beginning of the 69 weeks. So just to back up a second, the fact that they added an entire month to their calendar, this takes away from the dispensational futurists' math, because the 483 years added to the 444, 445 BC date comes to 38 or 39 AD, which is way too late for the triumphal entry or the crucifixion. Again, this takes care of that argument right here. The next one is the proposed commencement date and why it doesn't add up. They're choosing the wrong commencement date for the 70 weeks or the first 69 weeks of the prophecy, the 483 years. Okay. And we can know this even if for no other reason than because their math doesn't add up, as we've just seen. So when did the 70 weeks or 490 years prophecy actually begin? And let's look at, there are in fact 4 possible commencement dates for the beginning of the 70 weeks or 490 year prophecy of Daniel 9, 24 through 27, the word that went out to build Jerusalem. 4 possible commencement dates. The first one is the decree of Cyrus in 538 or 537 BC, found in Ezra chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, also found again in Ezra chapter 6, verses 3 through 5, and also found in 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verses 22 through 23. That's the first possible one. The next one is the decree of Darius the first, Hystaspes, in circa 520 BC. That means approximately 520 BC, found in Ezra chapter 6, verses 1 through 12. The third possibility, and this is the one I settle on right here, number 3, the third one, the first decree of Artaxerxes, found in 457 BC, found in Ezra chapter 7, verses 1 through 26. And I'm going to give you a reason for that and reasons for why I think this is the best commencement date. Because, first of all, the math actually adds up. And second of all, because of the nature of the decree. And 4, this is the one dispensational futurists settle on. The second decree of Artaxerxes in 444, 445 BC, found in Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 1 through 8. Okay, again, this is the one dispensational futurists settle on. Their math doesn't add up. This is the proper one, in my estimation. We're going to look at why. And the math adds up. Okay, add 483 years to this date, 457 BC, and you will come up to about 2627 AD, which is the time of the baptism of Jesus and the beginning of his earthly ministry, and Jesus' fulfillment of half of that 70th week, about the first half of the 70th week, and then in the midst of the week, he causes the sacrifices and oblations to cease, because he is the antitype who fulfilled the typology of the Old Testament sacrifices of the temple. He is antitype. He is fulfillment of that. Okay, so let's examine each one of these in order again. So the first decree of Cyrus, the royal decree. This was a royal decree from Cyrus, but it only dealt with the building of the temple or the house of God. The prophecy says about this, it talks about the city, not just the temple. This first decree of Cyrus only had, as it's recorded in Ezra chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, it only has to do with the temple or the house of God. Okay, see Ezra 1, verses 2 and 3. The second one, the royal decree of Darius, which was also a royal decree, was only a reiteration of the decree of Cyrus. Okay, the temple was being built in a troublous time. A lot of the Samaritans to the north were really troubled by the fact that the Jews were coming back home from Babylon, rebuilding their temple, and they kind of put up a fight about it, and they put up a huge fuss about it. The Samaritans primarily it was the Samaritans to the north, which of course would later cause a lot of bad blood between the Jews of the south and the Samaritans of the north. So that when Jesus comes along in the first century and he starts telling a parable about the Good Samaritan, this is pretty scandalous to most of the Jews because there was such bad blood between those groups. Jesus tells the parable of the Good Samaritan. Again, Jesus was not didn't go out for those he wasn't up for what do you call a popularity vote. He wouldn't have been very popular in preaching that parable, but truth outweighs popularity any day of the week. So the second decree, royal decree of Darius, is simply a reiteration of Cyrus' first decree, and it again had only to do with the building of the temple. See Ezra chapter 6, verses 7, 8, and 12. Then the first one, this is the one I'm going to settle on, and I'm going to give a reason why. The first royal decree of Artaxerxes, found in Ezra chapter 7, which was given in about 457 BC. 457 BC. This was a royal decree which allowed Ezra to, check this out, appoint magistrates and judges, administrators, and an administrative hub in Jerusalem, who may judge all the people in the province beyond the river, that is beyond the Euphrates River, so in Judah, all such as know the laws of your God. So magistrates and judges for Ezra's people, the Jews. And those who do not know them, you shall teach. You shall teach them. I mean, this is a basic, a reinstitution of the Jews to their own land. Magistrates, judges, and those who don't know your laws, teach them. In other words, teach your children these laws. Bring them up in your religion. I mean, this is hugely, this is a gift of autonomy to a new or renewed political nation. Okay, still under the umbrella of the Medo-Persian Empire, under Artaxerxes in the Medo-Persian Empire, but yet a real strong measure of autonomy, political autonomy for the Jews. And this is Artaxerxes' letters. Whoever will not obey the laws of your God and the law of the king, so he's equating himself, saying, hey, I'm still over you, but you guys go and you worship and teach your laws and you judge according to your laws. And whoever will not obey, let judgment be strictly executed on him, whether for death, for banishment, for confiscation of his goods, or for imprisonment. I mean, look at that. He's telling Ezra, when you appoint these judges and you judge in accordance with the laws of your God, you can execute judgment on those who break your laws. Even the death penalty, whether for death penalty, or for banishment, or for confiscation of his goods, or for imprisonment. As far as I know, in the first century, the Jews could not, they couldn't carry out the death penalty. That's why they had to bring Jesus before Pontius Pilate, because they couldn't just carry out the death penalty whenever they wanted. Okay, so even the Jews in the first century under the Roman Empire did not have the autonomy enough to carry out the death penalty. But here in Ezra, Artaxerxes is giving Ezra that authority. Okay, so that's why I think this is the decree. And of course, to appoint magistrates and judges, well, you need to have some buildings in which these magistrates and judges can perform their administrative duties. And if you're going to teach the laws, you probably have to have some schools to teach the laws, or some buildings. So this requires some buildings being built in the city of Jerusalem. Okay, so the city being built. Okay, it doesn't say it explicitly, I'm not saying that, but it most certainly is implicit in this decree that Ezra and the Jews who went with him from Babylon to Jerusalem would be able to build some administrative centers to perform their duties, all decreed by King Artaxerxes. Now, were there political reasons that Artaxerxes might have done this? Yeah, I mean, he might have wanted to gain favor with the Jews because he was concerned about Egypt rebelling against him, and if he needed to go down and fight against Egypt, he would probably have liked to have a pretty warm welcome in Jerusalem to have a military base in and around Jerusalem from which to launch an attack against the Egyptians if he had to. So there's all kinds of political stuff going on. I don't think Artaxerxes did this just because he was a nice guy. I think there was political issues involved here and whatnot. And we're going to see that because Artaxerxes the Samaritans again write a letter to Artaxerxes and say, hey, check your files, man. These people are rebellious. If you let them build their city and their administrative centers again, they're just going to rebel against you. And he actually causes the building to cease for a time. Okay, so Artaxerxes was a bit erratic too. So, but let's move on. This decree, by the way, from Artaxerxes in 457 BC, we're going to see that when we add the 483 years, we come right up to the proper time, 2627 AD, of the baptism of Christ. So this is the decree. This is the proper decree to begin the 70 weeks time prophecy. So the fourth decree, the second decree of Artaxerxes given to Nehemiah, was not an official royal decree. Just read Nehemiah chapter 2. Rather, it consisted of letters given to Nehemiah, who was the cupbearer of Artaxerxes, to present to the governors of the province beyond the river, that they may let me, Nehemiah, pass through until I come to Judah. Okay, so not an official royal decree, letters of passage for Nehemiah to go and do some repair work. This letter was given as a private letter to Nehemiah to engage in repair work to the gates of the temple and city wall, which had apparently been damaged by some overzealous Samaritans who were opposing the rebuilding of the rebellious city. See Ezra chapter 4. But what of the talk of Nehemiah chapter 2 that says, if it pleases the king Artaxerxes, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, to this city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it? Doesn't this decree have something to do with the rebuilding of the city? Answer, no. Apparently, the city had already been undergoing reconstruction for roughly 13 years when when Ezra went back to Judah and began the building of the administrative centers, as well as continuing work on the temple. So 13 years before Ezra was working on this, before Nehemiah's appeal to Artaxerxes and subsequent mission to Jerusalem, it appears that Ezra inferred that from the first decree made by Artaxerxes, again, not letters given to Nehemiah, it allowed him to not only appoint magistrates and judges, but that these magistrates and judges would need to have a place from which to fulfill their administrative duties, and that in fact they had already begun the reconstruction of the city proper and not just the temple by the time Nehemiah came to Jerusalem 13 years later. Nehemiah's repair work only took 52 days. Nehemiah 6:15, hardly enough time to complete the rebuilding of an entire city. Okay? In Ezra chapter 4, Ezra's not written in a strictly chronological way, but again, like most of the Bible, is a very thematic way. Okay, there are chronological aspects to it, but it's not strictly chronological. It's more thematic. In Ezra chapter 4, for example, we have recorded a number of issues the Jews faced from primarily Samaritan adversaries in rebuilding not only the temple, but the city itself. Again, how else would Ezra be able to appoint magistrates and judges of the people without having their administrative centers rebuilt? In Ezra 4, 7 through 23, the Samaritans wrote a letter to King Artaxerxes saying in part, that the Jews were rebuilding that rebellious and wicked city, and that if this city is rebuilt and its walls finished, you will then have no possession in the province beyond the river, that is beyond the Euphrates. In other words, they'll rebel against you if you give them all this stuff that you're giving them, okay? And the often erratic Artaxerxes did cause reconstruction to cease for a time until further notice. So rather than these letters given to Nehemiah in Nehemiah chapter 2, it is the royal decree of Artaxerxes given in 457 with permission to appoint magistrates and judges over. I think you see the point. That best fits the beginning date for the prophecy of Daniel 9:24 through 27 and the 70 weeks time prophecy. And then here's the math part. If we go with Cyrus's decree, 538, 537 BC, add 483 years, 69 weeks, takes us to 5554 BC. This decree doesn't fulfill the time of the Messiah recorded in Daniel 9:24 through 27. It's too early. Again, go with Darius' decree, which is simply a reiteration of Cyrus' decree, so it wasn't a new decree. Circa 520 BC, add 483 years to that, and you come to 37 BC. Again, this is way too early for the time of the Messiah as well. Artaxerxes' decree, the one that I'm settling on, the third possibility in the list of four, and this is the one I settle on, 457 BC, add 483 years to that, and you come to 2627 AD, the perfect time for the baptism of Jesus Christ by John the Baptist, his cousin or second cousin, and the starting point of the fulfillment of the 70th week and Christ's roughly 3 to 3.5 year ministry. Okay, perfect time for his baptism. Okay. And then the fourth one, the Artaxerxes letters given to Nehemiah. This is the decree that dispensational futurists use to begin the 483 years. And then they have to play all kinds of games with time in order to make it work, because this is way too late for the triumphal entry of Christ into Jerusalem and the subsequent crucifixion of him. Once again, dispensational futurists attempt to reconcile this discrepancy, claim the Jews used a 360-day year. They did for practical purposes, but every 6th year they added an entire month to their calendar to make up for the proper 365.25 days of the solar year, because they knew they were off. So this means if we begin from the proper decree of Artaxerxes, giving the Jews a tremendous amount of political autonomy from the Medo-Persian Empire, even though still being under the umbrella of the Medo-Persian Empire, but a tremendous amount of autonomy under that empire, which really started with Cyrus the Great. In fact, Cyrus is called Mashiach, Messiah, in the script, in the Bible. He is a type of Christ, a type of the Christ who was to come. But still, again, head of the Medo-Persian Empire. That's the one we want to fix on, because it's perfect. It measures up. It matches up perfect with the time. And this means that the 70th week, rather than ripped off from the previous 69 weeks and tossed somewhere 2,000 years out in the future, inserting a time gap where there's no biblical warrant, the 70th week of Daniel 9:24 through 27 included the baptism of Jesus. That's when the 70th week started. The beginning of his earthly ministry, his whole earthly ministry, in fact, his crucifixion, roughly 3.5 years into his earthly ministry, his resurrection and ascension into heaven, see Acts 1:9 through 11 and Revelation 12:5, and it included the subsequent 3.5 years of the, because about 3.5 years are left. If he's crucified 3.5 years into the 70th week, we have 3.5 years left. Okay. The subsequent roughly 3.5 years of the apostles' ministry, primarily to the Jews, the end of the 70th week, which I'm going to assert ended with the stoning of Stephen in Acts chapter 7. Stephen was the last prophet to the Jews. Remember, the prophecy had said to seal up the vision and prophet, might have been referring to this. I'm not going to be dogmatic about it, but I will say that everybody who's looked at Acts chapter 7 and Stephen's words in Acts chapter 7, his words are in the form of a covenantal lawsuit against the unbelieving Jews. Okay, and they killed him. They stoned him to death, which was, as far as I know, against Roman law. Again, they might have gotten away with things like that here and there, but as far as a formal act of execution, like what they wanted done to Jesus, that would not have been allowed by the Romans. Okay? So Acts chapter 7 is a covenantal lawsuit against unbelieving Jews. Okay? And then remember who was there holding the coats when Stephen was stoned to death? A man named Saul. Paul later became known as the Apostle Paul. Okay? A persecutor of the church at first. A religious Jew, scholarly Jew. He sat at the feet of Gamaliel. I call him Gamaliel the Wise, because Acts chapter 5, I always bracket that out in my Bible and say the wisdom of Gamaliel right on the side. And you can read Acts chapter 5 and see why that might be. Very wise thing Gamaliel said in Acts chapter 5. But Saul, who became the Apostle Paul, was a student of Gamaliel, and he persecuted the church at first until he was converted. So again, 70 weeks, been completed, has nothing to do with the Antichrist. The people of the prince that shall come, either referred to the Romans coming up to seize the city and destroyed the city of Jerusalem and the temple in 70 AD, or it refers to the people of the prince who will come, the unbelieving Jews who brought judgment on themselves for their unbelief. Okay, so this was judgment. I hope this video wasn't too long, but I hope it was substantive. I hope it really caught your attention on some of the things I said. I'm not the most charismatic speaker. I totally admit that. But this stuff for me is really exciting. I love Bible prophecy. I think it's fascinating. I think it's important. I'm not going to kick anybody out of the kingdom for not believing the way I do about Bible prophecy, but I do think it's important. It is important. So I hope this is helpful. Leave your comments down below, ask questions, and we'll talk to you soon. Soli Deo Gloria.